At one time or another, nearly every person on this earth has heard a ghost story. Good or bad, they are carried from person to person like a message. Sometimes they have morals. In the case of Mexico's La Llorona, they tell children to stay inside. Or, in America's urban legend of the Lady in White, they tell you not to pick up suspicious strangers from the side of the road. They hold real morals, real reasons to listen. But many of them, more than anything, are created to scare us. We hear as children stories of floating bodies, or of spirits that put bloody handprints on a mirror. But where do these stories come from? Are they always just like fables written by Aesop to teach us something? In this podcast, Giggles from the Graveyard, I'll be discussing specific stories and their historical happenstance, whether that is just the location, what it is, or sometimes specific people which lend themselves to interpretation. This can be seen easily when I talk about Hearst and all that he signified, or less so when I talk about things like the Jackson Hotel, in which we hear of people seeing things, but there are so many stories and residents that we cannot be completely sure what they may have based those stories on. All of these stories do come from California, as that is my home state. I myself come from, when you look up ghost towns in California, you find my town is number 2 or 3 despite being well populated. We hear of a haunted hotel, which I've gone in many times but never heard anything of. And this really inspired me to start telling you these stories. But in order to fully explain, and in order to fully have you understand why the historical circumstance makes a difference or is important, I have to make you fully understand a foundation of where do we get ghost stories in the first place? What were the first ghost stories? And what was the climate when they were created? One of our first examples of a ghost story comes from a philosopher named Pliny the Younger, or that's what he was called. His real name was Gaius Plinius Caelius Secundus, born Gaius Caecilius, or Gaius Caecilius Celio. It's all very hard to understand, but he was a Greek philosopher. He wrote hundreds of letters, many of which survive and have great historical importance and value. These are transcribed often in public records, and we can look into them for different philosophies as well as historical happenstance around this time. However, something that does stand out especially is he is known as the first person to talk about a ghost as a real human being that was once there. He described in his home someone chasing him or looking at him that was an old man rattling his chains. Anybody familiar with Charles Dickens' book, A Christmas Carol, will see the similarities immediately to a character named Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley is a ghost in that story as well, and it's easy to see where Charles Dickens would hear these similar stories and use them in his own book. But Pliny the Younger, why it's so important to understand who he was, is because this was not just someone on the street telling a story. We see a creative mind talking about something he believes is in his house in enough detail that it's as if he's talking about a general or a soldier he met. It's a very specific use of imagery and description based on something in his own house. What we can understand as well is we don't have all the evidence enough to know that this wasn't him writing in a fictional story. However, from historical records, we can see that others began writing about this same thing as if it was factual in the same way. This was the first example in which someone didn't just describe seeing a light, nor was it religious in tone, such as claiming it was an evil entity or maybe of the devil. This was a man saying that there was something in his house, a person, that had been there already. He later describes helping it and having it eventually leave, but what it does show is people were willing to believe in ghosts from how people continued writing these stories. People were willing to believe that there could be something after death that wasn't just religious. People were willing to believe that not just spirit or devils or even demons were here. They were ready to believe that a person's spirit was still here. This is interesting as it is also a time in which thought was really picking up in a more philosophical fashion. We see the rise of existentialism, nihilism, and even questions of, is there really God, and the like. This first changed everything. We began talking about seeing ghosts as real people who had died, and it began laying a foundation for more well-known ghost stories. Now, in the 1600s, we see another first, which would very largely influence our ghost stories. We see the first poltergeist. Now, in Germany, in 1654, there was a story about a family which had to deal with a poltergeist in their own farmhouse. Now, historians took this down and talked about what it was. The man who wrote the most about it, George Sinclair, also identified as a demonologist. Now, it's unsure with translations and such if he considered this to be a demon, but it did start another sort of ghost story, a bad ghost story. You see, with Pliny the Younger, the story was an old man in chains, an old man who wasn't really hurting Pliny, he just wanted to help the poor guy out. However, in the story of the German farmhouse, we see it cutting thread, we see it knocking bowls over. And what it changed was people also began to fear these stories. It became something different. It became more of a horror story. This changed and began, really, the genre of supernatural horror before we even saw it coming. Now, many believe this to be a true story, so I couldn't completely say that it was a fictional account or what started writers like Stephen King, but I can say that it was the first to create a story of any type with that. Now, as our ghost stories continued, they became more specific. Now, one famous ghost story that many people claim to hear and see is of the ill-fated Anne Boleyn. If you don't know anything about Anne Boleyn, she was one of the ill-fated wives of Henry VIII, the King of England. She herself gave birth to one of England's most famous monarchs, Elizabeth I, to whom I myself am a long descendant of by her sister. Now, Anne Boleyn, who was born in 1507 and died in 1536, was rumored by her enemies to be a witch. Many stories were made up about her to strike fear in the hearts of others. But what did really come out as well was that her husband hired a special swordsman to cut her head off so it wouldn't be as painful. You may be asking what this has to do with the ghost story, but I'll get to it. Now, records were changed about her. They added in different features that she didn't have, like an extra finger and a mole, to try and paint this figure of a woman that wouldn't be as desirable and it wouldn't make as much sense. They also began calling her a witch more and more and claiming that she would do evil things. This installed that same fear. But what really came out was many people wrote songs and told stories of seeing Anne Boleyn holding her head under her arm. Now, what does this have to do with cultural trends in the hundreds of years after she died? We see that, similar to Pliny the Younger, it was supposed to be a real person. We see a historical figure. But, like the German farmhouse, we see something that's supposed to instill fear. These came together to create what we use most commonly for our horror stories and our ghost stories and our horror stories involving ghost stories. We see the real person and we see them as a scary spirit. This completely changed the game when it came to ghost stories. Now, other ghost stories that we hear of are often around historical buildings today. People over and over say they go to Washington, D.C. and see George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, even though that's not where they died sometimes, walking around. Now, a lot of the time, this is people usually trying to capitalize or excite their friends with stories of seeing people that we look up to. But sometimes we get the opposite effect, such as people claiming in Chicago to see H.H. Holmes, one of the first well-known American serial killers. We use ghost stories from these foundational lines to tell stories which lend themselves to narrative. Now, Pliny the Younger, while I mention these letters, that's something that is actually interesting. However, much of his philosophy isn't as well mentioned. Now, in the same way, nobody talks about German politics of what farmhouses were like or how people lived. But you can bring up a German farmhouse and sometimes talk about the inner workings because of its ghost story. Even Anne Boleyn, who many American children I know don't learn about, learn through these songs about her carrying her head under her arm in a ghost story fashion. These ghost stories, we tell them to excite others and unknowingly to inform others. These foundations are what created the ghost stories we see today, and whether it's for malice, whether it's for excitement between children, or even ways to try and scare your adult friends, ghost stories have a history. Is it lengthy? Yes. But does it show a clear pattern? Always. Giggles in the Graveyard was created, written, and produced by Sabrina Jensen, myself. All the music is copyright and royalty free, and sources are in the link in the description or on a doc if requested. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in further listening, I'm sorry to inform you, this is only my senior project. So, I will only be making a few episodes, but it's fun to make them. If you ever run into me, tell me your ghost story. I may sound like I don't believe in them, but if you believe in them, I'm more likely to believe in them. That's simple psychology. Have a great day.